and welcome to Leaders in Conversation. I'm Anni, Townend, podcast host and partner to executives, leaders and their teams, co-founder of Collaboration Equation and of the podcast Finding Your Collaborative Edge with Lucy Kidd. Leaders in Conversation is the podcast in which leaders weave together the threads of their life and leadership stories, the people, places and experiences that have shaped them, their values, their beliefs, passion and purpose, to encourage and inspire you to be even more confident and courageous in your leadership. If you're not already, please do subscribe to the podcast, review and share it. Thank you. My guest today is Patrick Andrews, lawyer and co-founder with Erica Neve of Yoak. He is author of The Incomplete Circle, Rethinking Business from the Inside Out, published in 2025. And the title of our conversation is, Can Business Be a Path to Wholeness? In our conversation, Patrick offers valuable insights into participation, how real change can only happen when we move from observers to being participants. Wholeness and what it means to lead, organise and make decisions from a sense of interconnectedness rather than separation. And finally, flow, how as individuals and organisations we flourish when effort, skill and purpose align. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you, Annie. Nice to be here.
It's lovely that you're here, and I'm remembering where we met, which was in 2025 at Anthropy, and I'm delighted that we are both going to be at Anthropy 2026. And we actually met en route from one place to another, and I'm really thrilled that you agreed to be a guest on the podcast and excited to explore how business can be a path to wholeness. And I'd like to start with you and ask you about your path to wholeness, the people, the places and experiences that have shaped you and your values, beliefs, passion and purpose.
Yeah, thanks, Annie. Yeah, the path to wholeness is important because I couldn't claim to be as any destination. I can think of lots of influential people, but some key moments probably when I was in my early teens, being sent away to a holiday camp in Norfolk and falling in love with nature. That's the way I can describe it. At that age, you're open, you're just starting to flower in a way, open to influences. I just spent a lot of time outdoors and something changed me. I felt a deep sense of connection. Another key moment was at school deciding what career path am I going to take. I seemed to be quite good at exams and the law thing came up and I couldn't think of anything better, so I became a lawyer. And I think that weaving of the law and that deep sense of oneness with nature in its broadest sense and with people, a lot of my path can be understood through trying to understand the law, which is a really powerful lens through which to see society. It helps to understand power dynamics and political systems. So that's the mind in a way, the mind with its analytical skills, and then the body bringing its felt sense of, okay, this is what's really going on here. And I think when the body and the mind can really work in tandem in that way, then you just keep exploring life because you're constantly finding something new and new ways of relating to life. So my path has taken me down corporate lawyer and then climate change and deforestation. And I'm part of it because I'm in a big company, which is rather mindlessly pursuing growth. And then me thinking, I've got to leave this because it makes no sense anymore. And just trusting that sense of there's a path here and I'm going to try and find a path that's right for me. And along the way, all sorts of magical encounters with different people and seemingly randomly, but you look back and it seems to make a sort of sense.
A bit like ours, meeting on the path randomly and being introduced to each other and our agreeing to follow up. And in fact, when we followed up, I was in nature. I was walking along the River Leith in Edinburgh, if you may remember. And like you as a child, my happiest times were in nature when every Saturday we visited my father's mother, who lived in the Pennines. We also lived in the Pennines, where there was a sense of freedom, but also ability to connect with each other in a different way, in a way that perhaps we didn't when we were in our house in the town that we lived in.
I'm really interested in this concept of safety and psychological safety, though for some people going into the Pennines would be not at all safe. Yet when you learn that there's no one there to judge you, you can find a relationship where you feel, even though there may be risks of climbing mountains or wading through streams or whatever, I've always felt that sense of safety in nature, even in storms, top of mountains in a tent at night. I think it does nature. The impact on the mind, which is so important in the Western society, and mind's almost got out of control. So nature's a place where it can contain that, make you feel safe.
I'm smiling because whilst I felt safe in nature, I also learnt to fear cows and herds of cows, because my father really enjoyed teasing. So it didn't always feel safe because he would call the cows over. And of course, as children, myself and my sister being very small, were actually really frightened of these beasts. And whilst I know that these wonderful animals are okay most of the time, and I'm really conscious and have written about it myself, that not everybody is safe. My previous guest, Marissa Kismel, was talking about GKN and how they're a global company and they work in some environments where the factory, being in manufacturing, is the safest place emotionally and physically for people to be, because the environment around the factory may be one of poverty and struggle. And so it's actually safer for some people to be in work than on the street or in their homes.
I'm reminded of a conversation I had with the former head of people of John Lewis. He was there 30 or 40 years and knew the original Mr. Lewis. And he said that customers were so passionate about John Lewis, they'd say, if there was a nuclear raid, which I think when he was there could be a thing, or the possibility was talked about, they knew they'd come to John Lewis because that's where they'd feel safe.
That's amazing. And it's interesting that when we think about experience, isn't it? Where do we feel safe? And when I studied for 3 years, I never spoke in seminar groups. I learnt not to speak for fear of being teased or ridiculed. And for 3 years in my seminar group, I didn't speak. And if somebody had said to me then, one day you will go and work with teams, with groups of all sizes where you know nobody, and you will help them to have open conversations, to understand, deepen their understanding of each other, and that you can do this. Very fortunately for me, in my early 20s, I had the experience of being in a group and that feeling of safety that came with trust as well. So there's something about what you're saying about the people who would go to John Lewis or being in nature for you, where you feel safe, but you also, and not everybody feels this, can trust yourself in nature and trust nature.
There's an awful lot of trust we place in people who aren't really capable of satisfying that trust in leaders. It's easy to fall into this. That tall, confident person who's paid a lot of money to be very competent, we can trust them, and that can mean we switch off our own sense of, what do I really feel and think? What's my place in all this? So, yeah, and our systems often do that. They elevate people and make them look very shiny.
And very tall. I was smiling then, you said that very tall person, because when I met people who I'd never met before after COVID, I noticed in the teams and groups that I was working with in person that people would meet each other for the first time and say, gosh, I didn't realise you were so tall, to the people who were tall. I'm quite small, and nobody ever said to me, I didn't realise how small you were. Isn't that interesting?
It is interesting, and I'm reminded of a statistic that said it was almost impossible to be a chief executive of the FTSE 100 unless you're at least 5'10" or something. there were very few, because in a way, system produces the sort of people who look like what we expect a leader to look like. And I guess that's really been my field, is the systems rather than the individual. I'm interested in what sort of leaders does a system produce and what sort of presidents does the US Constitution produce, rather than obsessing about the particular individual at a particular time, but what tweaks could you make to the system to change what outputs you get?
Is this where participation comes in, that whilst we are there as an observer, we're on the sidelines, we're observing, we're watching, and what you're suggesting is a different way of doing business where we create an environment in which we become participants more of the time?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a strong theme of what I've learned through working in organizations of all shapes and sizes in different countries. As the lawyer, you're often in a privileged position to be an observer in board meetings and places other people don't go. And I've definitely noticed that places that feel more alive, organizations feel more alive, are where are feeling a sense of agency, feeling a sense of connection to what they're about. Meaning is another word for it. And the people who feel that, or who feel that sense of, I can make a difference here, the organization becomes much more alive, and it may or may not be more profitable. It would tend to be more successful in whatever measures you want to say, but it definitely is a better place. It's a more alive place to be and to work. It's a place you want to stay, you want to participate in. I'm confident that it's impossible to prove with evidence-based stuff, but actually those are more successful in the broadest sense, successful for shareholders, successful for whichever useful measure you can bring, and soft or hard measures. And I suppose that really came alive for me in Riverford, when I worked with for organic farmers who were shifting to employee ownership. And they had this incredibly inspiring leader he's on Desert Island Discs, and Guy Singh Watson. And he would admit himself, he really liked people and respected and trusted them. And yet they knew, and he knew, when it comes to it, I will decide. And if I wanted it, well, it will happen my way. Quite a lot of male energy in the business. It was quite physical in the early days, carrying around heavy boxes of vegetables and so on. And after 30 years of this, he realized, okay, I'm in my late 50s. It's time for me to step back and let others show up. And it was like a whole body transformation of these 600-person organization. And my role in particular was to say, how do we engage the people? And there was a technical question about structure, which the board and Guy were sitting with and weren't quite sure what. It was very complex. And they thought, don't know. And Guy was bold enough to say, let's ask the people. But so one way might be a survey, but I said, well, actually, the way to do this is to invite who wants to be involved in the conversation that's about this transition to employee ownership. 20 people either volunteered or were volunteered, but from across finance, IT, or packing, or farming, relatively random section of people, 20 people. And we got them in a room and spent 3 hours just saying, here's what the implications of this are. Here's the different elements of it. Here's what employee ownership means. What do you think? And go and ask your colleagues what they think. And they went away, and a couple of weeks later came back. We said, here's the pros of this way of structuring, which was about, do people have individual shares or are the shares held collectively? And there's different arguments in the literature about which is better in which circumstances and so on. But one of them was clearly favourable from an individual point of view in terms of tax and money. And the management team thought, I'm pretty certain they'll go for that one. And the other one was about collective ownership. And basically the conversation after all this time was, what's really important for us is solidarity. Because if you're in a cold shed packing vegetables for 8 hours a day, and you know your neighbour has got shares and you haven't because you couldn't afford them, it's going to cause tension that wouldn't otherwise be there. It will weaken the team spirit. And so 19 out of 20 of them voted at the end to go with the collective. And you could always hear the sound of the jaws dropping of the management team. Good people, very thoughtful, really a pleasure to work with, but they'd never really witnessed the power of the collective to be thoughtful, wise, considerate, selfless, in the spirit of what are we here for and what's the company about. I've done a fair amount of facilitation. There was an awful lot of love in the room. That's sort of the language I tend to use, which people can understand. They just really wanted to do the right thing for the business. And given the opportunity, they were able to. But if you'd asked them, almost any of the individuals, they'd have probably closed up because they wouldn't know how to start to think about it. And so they wouldn't have the confidence. Whereas if you've been to Eton, you know you'll have an opinion, even if you haven't thought about it. You just know how to be confident when you don't really have information. And that's the trap a lot of board directors get into, in my experience, is they've just learned that it's better to say something because then you're seen. And maybe it's more of the males than the females, but there's certainly that energy of, I'm on the board, I'm expected to say something, otherwise how am I contributing? And I think that's a really difficult one, those in authority to deal with, to handle, to say, I don't know, we better ask. Whereas what was really powerful about this, I really am interested in psychology and people dynamics, which we touched on a bit, safety and so on. So there's a science to organising. So when you've got 20 people in a room, you don't just say, what do you think, or ask questions. You say, take a minute, particularly for the introverts, take a minute just to reflect on what you've heard. Sense into what you're feeling about this, not even thinking, feeling. Then take 2 minutes to turn to your neighbour and exchange. And they may not be comfortable speaking in 20 people, but they're comfortable speaking with one who's a colleague, a peer. And then what that does is immediately start to articulate and they start to understand it better. Not a good idea or a brilliant idea. They then get into fours for 5 minutes and share. And from that, you're doing a triage, a way of filtering, validating. So then you go around and say, we've got 5 groups of 4. What's happening? And then you listen and you're all going. The room is alive with wisdom and thoughtfulness, 20 different perspectives distilled into something that's intelligible, not chaos. And I think very often the leaders understandably fear the chaos. What if we bring 20 people in the room and they all vote? Which would have been clear. If they'd done a vote from the beginning, it would have been 19 out of 20 for take the money. But give them a chance to have a thoughtful conversation that's facilitated. And then that group went on to be the foundation for the elected co-owner council, which meets twice a month and engages with the board and brings a balance where suddenly it gives meaning to this idea of the employees are the owners.
Really great example, Patrick. I think of building safety together as well. So giving people time to think at the beginning, that you've heard this or there's been this idea, giving people time to think on their own, which for some of us is really important before we speak. Then turning to your neighbour who you may or may not know and have certainly probably never had this conversation with them. And then together into fours, or depending on the size of the group, obviously with 20 it's helpful to build up to that speaking. For me, that is about everybody participating in creating safety, something which Lucy Kidd, who you've met, and I talk about a lot in our collaboration equation, where we build the foundations of safety, where people are seen, heard, and hopefully understood. But the experience of being seen and heard, how am I, then being seen by you in the conversation, and then more widely in the group with people looking at you, clearly listening, and then diverse voices are brought in and thought and feeling. And it's a very inclusive environment in which everybody has a space and a place to be able to participate. And as you were talking, I was thinking many organisations do employee engagement surveys. And I wonder, and I'm curious now, and I'm going to investigate this, is whether what we're really talking about in a strange way is participation. Do I feel able to participate? Is my participation welcomed? Am I helping other people to participate? Is such an important question, I think. Are we creating a structure, a culture in which people can participate?
Yeah, language is really powerful, isn't it? If you think about the simplistic way of seeing an organisation where you've got the leadership and the rest, it can be seen as employee engagement of those people engaged in our project. There's a project which is about boosting the share price or whatever it is, and then there's a bunch of staff that you're trying to engage. And so it can easily be a separating thing. We've got a thing and we need you to be engaged in our thing. Participation, it's both more challenging, more scary, and much more powerful, because are you bringing some of yourself into this? Are you participating? And that needs give and take. It needs space to participate. It needs an invitation to participate, or at least not a refusal to allow participation.
Patrick, you spoke about facilitated. It is facilitated. So that seems to be important as well.
If there's 5 people, we as humans know how to work in 5 or 10 people, or 15 maybe. You still know how to, once you're beyond 25 or 30, you have to really change things. And then some sort of science of organising needs to be used. I'm not a fan of Amazon and what it stands for in a way, but I can be absolutely sure that Jeff Bezos was a genius in terms of how you get people to participate in some way. It's not everybody, and I'm sure the people walking 26 miles a day in the big Amazon factories will say, well, I'm not. But a friend of mine who worked for Amazon talked a lot about the way they organised and the amount of autonomy he felt he had. So I think that ability to genuinely allow others to have ownership is one of the most tangible ways of making people feel that, allowing people to feel that. Not only am I participating, it's a strange sort of altruism we expect of people to come in and work hard and the profits go to people you'll never meet on the stock exchange. So if you're saying we're selflessly pursuing profits, we say, and yet we're altruistically giving all the benefits to some people in big wealthy firms around the world. So very paradoxical the way we organise our ownership. So the deepest form of participation is when people not only are owners, but treated as owners with the rights of owners.
And that's where you get to wholeness, I'm thinking, and the path to wholeness in business through participation and through a different kind of leadership. Patrick?
I think that's right. I think that's been a theme for me for over 20 years, is trying to explain to people that you shouldn't be surprised when we get these stories, if you look for them every day, every week, of a large company who says one thing and then they do the opposite. A fossil fuel company who says passionately, we really care about the long-term and future health of our children. And then they're relentlessly exploring, looking for more and more oil to burn. They're suppressing legislation which restricts fossil fuel emissions and so on. Or even more stark is pharmaceutical companies who say they're about healing the sick, but they promote drugs when they've been proven they're killing people. There's myriad stories about this. You generally can't really understand it unless you start looking at, okay, but you say one thing, but the purpose says you exist for something else. The purpose is embedded in the structure. You serve shareholders, and therefore moneyed interest is what you serve. So therefore, it's completely consistent to say we don't mind a bit of asbestos in our talcum powder, particularly even for babies, because actually the worst that happens is we get a fine and still the money makes sense. It doesn't make sense at a human level at all in any manner of ways. It doesn't make sense when you look at what Johnson say they stand for. So flip the ownership and suddenly why are you doing this? And you're exposed. Whereas what often happens in companies which are owned by other people remotely who have no vested interest other than financial is you get this very perverse behaviour. And when I was told by this head of people from John Lewis, he said that it was very hard to survive in John Lewis if he didn't have integrity, which I found really interesting. And I think integrity and wholeness are very closely intertwined in my mind. So my work's always been about saying, how do you align the basic culture, structures, governance, ways of working of organizations to seek that elusive wholeness? What is it that people in the organization cohere around? By choice, because ideally you want them to have as much autonomy as collective working. And that's philosophically, conceptually, that's the real balance, the dance, if you like, between the individual and the collective.
It's a dance of interconnectedness, isn't it?
It's a dance of interdependence, interconnectedness. It's yin and yang. It's these essential apparent opposites. And it's what the quantum physicists explored in the 60s, 70s. They said, how is it that light can both show up as a stream of particles and yet look at it from a different perspective, and it's a wave. So it's both individuals and it's also collective, and that's this human dance. And it's playing with that and understanding those dynamics where people lose themselves in organizations is interesting for me, where they start doing evil behavior they'd never do it on their own, but it feels normal and loyal and correct within the confines of Tesco or Johnson or whoever.
There's a sense there, I think, and moving into thinking about flow, where when people are attuned and aligned to their own values and beliefs and passion and purpose and connect it with that of the organisation. In our conversation, there's a sense of interconnectedness. I think finding ourselves, finding who we are and why we're here, and something you talk a lot about in the book, which is really important to me as well, is about being very conscious of ourselves in our bodies, the physical. I co-lead the Marketing Leaders Programme with Ross Pocock for the Marketing Society and Accenture Song. And I can remember this neuroscientist coming to speak with us and asking who were those people in the group, community of marketing leaders, who thought physically. And my hand shot up. I absolutely think physically. And I was in a minority, Patrick, which kind of didn't surprise me. But I thought it is something which I do pay attention. And I know when I'm out of sorts, it's often when I haven't been taking care of my body or I haven't been listening to my body and lose sight of what I literally stand for.
Yeah, I find I struggle to make sense of life without using metaphors and analogies because it's so complex. In organizations, you can use thousands of metaphors for an organization and they can all be helpful or not. The human body is what I often refer to because I talked about participation. And I'm someone who is very comfortable in my head. I used to read a lot when I was young, but I've always noticed that I make the best decisions when I'm, as you say, in my body. It might be wandering through the forest and a tree will whisper something to me. And if I'm tuned in, but many people will say this, their best ideas come when they're, in the shower or lying in bed at 4 a.m. or going for a jog or something, or just before they have the morning coffee or just after maybe. But it's not sitting at the desk going on an Excel spreadsheet. And I think I noticed that, okay, so if all my 50 trillion cells we have in our body, if they're all playing a role and they're all really, and we know mind and body are intimately connected, you can't really separate them. But the mind says you can. The mind says, I'm more important. The heart quietly knows, I think. And I use that to say, okay, if the body is the mass of people in an organization and the head is the leadership team, who's kidding who about who's in charge and whether it's useful to pretend you're in charge? Because let's face it, you can't really control another human being, never mind 2 million that are in Walmart or even 10 in the team. If I'm not in charge, then I'm in relationship. And if that's the relationship we have with our bodies, then we can really use all the amazing sensing capability we have as humans. And then the mind can be an amazing servant to say, given that feeling that's coming up, how do we articulate that? How do we express that? What decisions do we make? Based on all this information, this rich information that doesn't show up in words, or sometimes it does. And a lot of deep wisdom, deep philosophy talks about that. It's pay attention to your breath, the deep rhythm, pay attention to the cycles of the planets, of the moon, because we know that affects our body too. Pay attention to what's going on in your body. And then actually the mind will almost look after itself. But if you try and say, it's all about the mind and the body's just a thing to move my head from meeting to meeting, you're really missing what modern science tells us is 99.99% of the information that's accessible to you. And I find that in organizations that too often our structures and our ways of thinking close us off from the deep knowledge. If you see an organization as a body, not as of an amorphous mass of individuals, but actually as different energies around the leadership team and the different parts of the finance team and so on. They've all got different energies. And if you start to sense into how they interrelate, then you can really start to work out where should decisions belong and who's making what decisions and who's that serving. And where's the conscience of the organisation? And where's the challenge? And where's peace? Where's insight? Where's long-term thinking?
Wonderful, Patrick. What a lot to think about and lots of questions being asked. As we come to the close of our conversation, I'd like to ask you 2 final questions for you. But the first one is, as a result of our conversation, who is the person you're going to have a conversation with following this episode? And what's the conversation going to be about?
One would be, I'll go and find a friendly tree, because I find listening to trees, communicating with nature beyond, and I live in a forest, so there's lots of trees about. I think there isn't one individual. I'm working with a company that's transitioned into employee ownership, and there's something there where there's a real struggle to bring into being, to follow the logical conclusion of the employees of the owners, when the old habits still say that 2 or 3 people at the top, they're the ones who can really be trusted. And so I think this will remind me that of the different approaches to take the safety of those individuals, the path they can go on, to actually free themselves up from this weight of, I've got to do everything. I've got to make all the decisions. When other people are gagging for a bit more responsibility and a bit more information about what's going on. So I'm going to bring that gently into my conversations with them.
Fantastic. Thank you, Patrick. And as we come to the very end of our conversation, what are your 3 key encouragements to listeners, to leaders listening to this conversation who would like to do business differently and bring more wholeness?
It's an ongoing journey. And I think, so the 3 encouragements were all about listening. One was listening to yourself. And that could be in the bath, in the shower, on a quiet walk. Just what's really going on for you? And just ask the question. It's amazing. Hi, body, what's going on? And it can sound terribly trite and silly, really, and not at all professional as important, but actually really listening to ourselves is an amazing starting point for all this work, particularly if you're in authority, if you've got any sort of leadership role or aspire to be. I think then starting to listen to yourself, you start to understand maybe what it means to listen to others. And again, that's too often what we call listening is waiting for someone to finish so that we can get our thoughts in. It's not really seeking insight, being willing to learn, being willing to change. It's not a relationship, it's a transaction. You say something, then it's my turn. Like playing tennis, how can I win? What's the weak points? Deep listening. And there's a lot of good mindfulness practices about this. And I think at an organizational level, that can be, how do you really listen to customers? How do you know you listen to customers or your people? So there's that. And then there's listening to, the universe unfolding. So listening, but listening with discernment, not just listening and for stimulation or titillation about what the latest politician's done or not done, but really listen to what is really going on and what am I noticing and how am I responding to that? And I think that's a journey of a lifetime and more.
Fantastic, Patrick. Thank you so much. And if and when people would like to get in touch with you to find out more, how best for them to contact you?
I'm on LinkedIn, so professionally it's fairly easy to find me on LinkedIn. The main vehicle for my work these days is called Yoak, Y-O-A-K. It's an old English word for something that joins things together. So yoak.uk, you can find me there. And my book is on Amazon too.
The Incomplete Circle, which is such a good title. Having read it, I encourage you, the listener, to read it. To listen to other leaders in conversation, do go to my website, annitownend.com. To listen to Finding Your Collaborative Edge with Lucy Kidd and I, go to our website, Collaboration Equation. A big thank you to Schmogus Media for the wonderful production and marketing of the podcast. To Louisa Penny from Penny Writing. To contact me, please email me on Anni@AnniTownend, visit my website, subscribe to my newsletter, and of course follow me on LinkedIn. I look forward to connecting with you, and thank you for listening. And thank you, Patrick, for sharing your insights and for your encouragement to us all to listen more deeply.
Thank you, Annie.